The doorbell's chime cut through the gathering dusk like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the careful stillness Silas Thorne had constructed around his life. He stood in the hallway of his modest Elm Street townhouse, one hand on the worn brass doorknob, momentarily frozen. Hold on just a moment before we continue. If this story is touching something in you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely makes a difference and helps me bring you more stories like this one. I also want to hear from you. Write in the comments, where are you right now? Are you tucked away in a peaceful village where stars fill the sky, or surrounded by the hum and glow of a city that never sleeps? The sound itself wasn't unusual, but something about this particular evening, this exact moment when twilight painted his windows in shades of amber and violet, made his heart skip in a way he couldn't explain. He'd spent the entire day convincing himself that tonight would be unremarkable. Another evening in the long chain of evenings that had defined his year. Leftover pasta reheated in the microwave, perhaps that documentary about Antarctic explorers he'd saved, maybe a few pages of the novel gathering dust on his nightstand. The kind of night that passes without leaving a mark, comfortable in its numbness, safe in its predictability. He'd gotten good at those nights. Too good, perhaps. But when Silas finally pulled open the door and found his two aunts standing on his welcome mat, travel bags slung over their shoulders and smiles bright despite the fading light, something inside him cracked. Not painfully, but like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. Aunt Beatrice stood on the left, tall and elegant even in her travel-worn jacket, her silver hair swept back in a graceful bun. Her eyes, the color of sea glass, held that same patient warmth he remembered from childhood, the kind that saw everything but judged nothing. Beside her, Aunt Camille practically vibrated with energy, her compact frame wrapped in a colorful shawl, her copper curls escaping from a loose ponytail. She was already grinning, already leaning forward as if she might burst through the doorway on enthusiasm alone. "Silas, darling." Camille's voice carried the music of genuine delight. "Surprise!" We were driving through the mountains and thought, why on earth wouldn't we stop and see our favorite nephew? Beatrice's smile was quieter but no less warm. "We hope this isn't a bad time. We should have called," but Camille insisted on spontaneity. Silas blinked, his mind struggling to shift gears. "I know, of course not. Come in, please." He stepped aside, and they swept into his entryway, bringing with them the scent of lavender and road trip coffee, the energy of movement and life. Camille immediately began exclaiming over the small changes to his decor, while Beatrice set down her bag with practiced efficiency and studied him with those perceptive eyes. As Silas helped them with their coats and bags, he became acutely aware of how the house felt different with them in it. The hallway seemed brighter, though he hadn't touched the lights. The air felt less stagnant, as if windows had been opened to let in fresh wind. Even the familiar creak of the floorboards sounded different, less lonely somehow. He ushered them into the living room, his mind racing through mental checklists. Clean mugs. Fresh towels for the guest room. Did he have enough food for breakfast? When was the last time anyone besides him had sat on that sofa? "I'll make tea," he said quickly, needing something to do with his hands. "Or coffee. I have both, and I think there are some biscuits, or I could." "Tea would be lovely." Beatrice interrupted gently, settling onto the couch with the ease of someone who knew how to make themselves at home without being intrusive. "But only if you're having some. Don't fuss on our account." Camille had already kicked off her shoes and was curling up in the armchair by the window. "This place is just as cozy as I remembered." "Oh, Silas, you kept the painting I sent you for your birthday." He glanced at the small watercolor of a lighthouse that hung above the bookshelf. "Of course I did. It's beautiful." While he prepared the tea in the kitchen, his hands moving through the familiar ritual, Silas could hear his aunts chatting in the other room, their voices weaving together in comfortable harmony. Memories surfaced unbidden. Sunday dinners at Beatrice's sprawling farmhouse, Camille teaching him to bake bread when he was 8, holidays where the house overflowed with cousins and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of family. A time when his life had felt full, when loneliness was just a word in the dictionary, not a constant companion. When he returned with a tray of elderflower tea and the good china cups he rarely used, rain had begun its gentle percussion against the bay window. The sound was soothing, rhythmic, like nature's own heartbeat. Silas settled into his usual chair across from them and poured carefully, grateful for the ritual that gave his nervous hands purpose. "So tell us everything," Camille said, accepting her cup with a warm smile. "How's the bookstore? Are you still managing the poetry section?" "Still am," Silas replied, keeping his tone light. We've actually expanded it a bit. Added some contemporary voices, local authors. It's doing well. And the town? Beatrice asked, her gaze steady. Are you settling in? Making connections? The question was casual, but Silas heard the weight beneath it. Hilm Street is quiet. Nice. The neighbors are friendly enough. He could feel them watching him as he spoke, not with intrusion but with the careful attention of people who genuinely cared. For the past year, Silas had perfected the art of seeming fine. He'd learned to modulate his voice just so, to smile at the right moments, to construct sentences that sounded full while saying nothing. After Lena left, after their 5-year relationship dissolved not in fury but in a quiet, mutual acknowledgement that they'd grown into different people wanting different lives, Silas had folded up his pain like a letter and tucked it somewhere deep inside. He'd never told anyone how profoundly it had hurt. There was no dramatic story to tell, no betrayal or explosion. Just two people who'd loved each other realizing that love, somehow, wasn't enough. Lena had moved to Portland for her dream job. He'd stayed in Harper Vale with his bookstore. They'd hugged goodbye at the train station, both crying, both wishing things were different. And then she was gone. The absence was louder than any fight could have been. How about sleep? Beatrice asked, her tone deliberately casual as she sipped her tea. Are you sleeping well? Fine, Silas said automatically. The usual, you know. He didn't mention the nights when he lay awake until 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, or the mornings when dragging himself out of bed felt like lifting a mountain. He didn't mention that fine had become his default setting, a protective shell that kept the world at arm's length. But his aunts didn't push. Somehow, that made it harder. They simply nodded, shared a glance, and Camille launched into a story about a wrong turn they'd taken in the mountains that had led to a hidden waterfall. Silas laughed at the right moments, but inside, he felt exposed in a way that made his chest tight. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily. Rain continued its gentle whisper, and Silas became hyper-aware of every evening he'd spent alone in this room, the silence broken only by the television's blue glow or the turning of pages. He wondered if his aunts noticed how carefully maintained everything was, how nothing looked truly lived in. The throw pillows were perfectly arranged, no dishes in the sink, no clutter. It was a home designed for solitude, optimized for one person moving through space without leaving traces. Beatrice's gaze traveled slowly around the room, taking in the neat shelves, the dust-free surfaces, the framed photographs arranged with geometric precision. Silas felt seen in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. Camille set down her cup and smiled, her eyes crinkling. Do you remember the time you were convinced you could teach Marmalade to read? You made flashcards and everything. Despite himself, Silas smiled. Marmalade had been Beatrice's ancient golden retriever. I was 7. I thought if I could read, why couldn't he? You've always had such a generous heart, Beatrice said softly, always seeing potential in everyone and everything. The comment landed differently than Camille's teasing. Silas felt something twist in his chest. He'd once imagined filling this house with exactly this kind of warmth, permanently. Sunday brunches where friends gathered around his table. Lady-night conversations about philosophy and dreams. A partner to share midnight snacks and inside jokes. Children, maybe, someday. A life abundant with connection. Now those dreams felt like they belonged to a stranger. Someone naive. Someone who hadn't learned yet how easily beautiful things could slip away. As the evening deepened, Silas felt a bone-deep weariness settle over him, the kind that sleep never quite fixed. It was the exhaustion of holding yourself together, of performing normalcy, of insisting to yourself and everyone else that you're fine, really, totally fine. But his aunts didn't seem in any hurry to retire. They stayed on the couch, unhurried, as if they had nowhere else to be, no schedule to keep. Camille told stories that made them all laugh. Beatrice asked gentle questions about his life that somehow never felt invasive. And slowly, imperceptibly, Silas felt his shoulders start to relax. Finally, near midnight, they settled into the guest room. Silas stood alone in the living room afterward, lights dimmed, listening to rain tap against glass. An unfamiliar sensation was rising in his chest, something he couldn't quite name. Not pain, not exactly comfort either. Something stranger, anticipation. He didn't understand why this visit felt different from previous family drop-ins. Only that it did. The air in the house felt charged, like the moment before lightning, pregnant with possibility. Silas turned off the lamps and headed upstairs to bed, unaware that the simple sound of that doorbell was the first tremor in an earthquake that would reshape his world. Unaware that this seemingly casual visit was actually the beginning of a change he'd quietly stopped believing was possible. Morning arrived with gentle insistence. Sunlight spilled through Silas's kitchen window as he sat across from Beatrice and Camille, cradling a mug of black coffee, feeling more exposed in daylight than he had in last night's shadows. He'd barely slept, their conversation having stirred feelings he'd carefully packed away. "Silas," Beatrice said, her voice gentle but direct. "How are you doing? Truly. Not the version you tell acquaintances at the grocery store." Camille reached over and squeezed his hand. "We're not here to judge, sweetheart. We're family." Something in that simple statement cracked something open inside him. Words tumbled out, halting at first, then faster. He told them about Lena, about the relationship that had felt like forever until it wasn't, about the quiet way love had slipped through his fingers, leaving him grasping at nothing. He described the months afterward where he'd thrown himself into work, into routines, into anything that kept him moving without having to feel. "It wasn't dramatic," he heard himself saying. "There was no villain. We just grew apart. And I think I just got better at being numb." Camille's eyes glistened. "When I was 25, I was engaged. His name was Daniel. I loved him desperately, but I was terrified of commitment, so I ended it." She paused. "I spent 7 years convinced I'd made the right choice. By the time I realized I was just running from vulnerability, he'd moved on." "Don't let fear make your decisions, Silas." Beatrice set down her cup. "After my divorce, I swore off love. Built a perfect little life where I was safe and untouchable, and I was miserable." She looked directly at him. "Vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the only path to real connection. Closing your heart means you're already broken, just differently." They talked through the morning about regrets and small victories, forgotten dreams. Silas mentioned his dream of hosting a community open mic night at the bookstore, abandoned when Lena left. "Why can't it be just your dream now?" Beatrice asked simply. The question startled him. Why couldn't it? "We have a confession," Camille said suddenly. "This visit wasn't spontaneous. We've been worried about you for months. We've heard it in your voice, seen it in your emails. We didn't come to fix you, but to remind you that you're not alone. That your story isn't finished." Silas's throat tightened. They'd come for him. Driven hours because they'd sensed he was drowning. The realization brought tears he'd held back for months. He cried, and they held him, and it felt like the first real breath he'd taken in a year. By afternoon, Camille mentioned a harvest festival fundraiser in the town square that evening. "Want to come?" Silas hesitated, then heard himself say, "Okay. Yeah." The town square glowed with Edison bulbs strung overhead. Folk music drifted from a small stage. The scent of kettle corn and cinnamon filled the air. Silas felt anxiety spike, but his aunts flanked him, and their presence made it manageable. Then he saw her. Dark hair in a braid, forest green sweater, laughing at something a vendor said. Something about her presence was quietly magnetic. Silas drifted toward her table. They reached for the same journal simultaneously. "Sorry," she laughed. "You were here first?" "No, please," Silas said. She smiled, her hazel eyes flecked with gold. "How about we both look? Are you a writer?" she asked. "I work at a bookstore, but I've always wanted to be." "You?" "I teach English. I keep buying blank journals thinking they'll inspire my novel. I'm Alara." Silas. What started as a brief exchange continued. They discovered shared loves, obscure poetry, rainy days, complicated feelings about home. Alara spoke with intelligence and humor, asking questions that showed genuine listening. "I just got out of a long relationship," Alara admitted. 8 months ago. "But it still feels fresh." "A year for me," Silas said. "And some days it feels like yesterday." Understanding passed between them, needing no words. They found a bench beneath an oak tree. Around them, the festival hummed, but Silas's attention narrowed to Alara, to their conversation unfolding with surprising depth. "The hardest part," Alara said, "is believing it's possible to try again, to let someone in when you know exactly how badly it can hurt." "Yes," Silas breathed, "exactly that." Across the square, his aunts watched with poorly concealed delight. Beatrice caught his eye and gave a subtle thumbs up. The evening unfolded naturally. They talked through performances, through the crowd thinning. When the festival wound down, Alara suggested a walk. They strolled quiet streets, conversation flowing, punctuated with comfortable silences. "This has been really nice," Alara said, stopping under a street lamp. "I wasn't planning on meeting anyone tonight, but I'm glad I did." "Me too," Silas said completely. "Could I get your number? Maybe coffee sometime." Hope fluttered in his chest, fragile and wonderful. "I'd really like that." They exchanged numbers. Walking home with his aunts, Silas felt something he hadn't in months. Genuine excitement about the future. Not certainty, but the simple, profound feeling that good things were still possible. The next morning, his aunts prepared to leave. At the door, Camille hugged him fiercely. "You're gonna be happy. I can feel it. Beatrice kept her hands on his shoulders, looking into his eyes. Don't close your heart just because it was broken, Silas. The world has so much more to offer you. Let it in. He watched their car disappear, feeling the house different now. Not empty, but spacious with possibility. His phone buzzed. Alara is still thinking about our conversation. Coffee tomorrow afternoon. Silas smiled. Absolutely. I know the perfect place. He looked around his living room. His aunt's brief visit had shifted something fundamental. They'd reminded him he wasn't alone, that vulnerability was strength, that his story was far from over. Their gift hadn't been fixing him. They'd simply shown up, paid attention, and loved him exactly as he was while encouraging him to become who he could be. That afternoon, Silas stopped at the community bulletin board and wrote, OPEMEKINIGHT Poetry Prose Music Welcome every Thursday 7 p.m. AM Street Books, all voices, all stories, all hearts invited. A small act, but it felt monumental. A dream resurrected. A declaration that he was ready to engage with life again. Over following days, Silas emerged from his cocoon. Coffee with Alara went so well they stayed 3 hours. They made plans for another meeting. And another. He threw himself into planning open mic night, feeling creative energy he'd thought lost. He reached out to friends he'd been avoiding. He let his house be lived in, leaving books on tables, evidence of life actively inhabited rather than curated. His conversations with Alara deepened. They took walks, discovering shared loves of autumn leaves and terrible horror movies. They talked about their pasts honestly but didn't let those pasts define their present. Cautious but not closed. Careful but hopeful. Weeks later, after his first successful open mic night, Silas stood in his living room. The bookstore had been packed with poets and musicians, the air thick with creative energy. Alara had sat in the front row, her smile encouraging. Now, in quiet aftermath, he thought about the doorbell that had rung weeks ago. How 2 aunts showing up unannounced had catalyzed everything. How their gentle intervention reminded him he was loved, that he deserved happiness, that closing himself off was a kind of death. He thought about Beatrice's wisdom and Camille's energy, about their stories of regret and resilience, about how they'd created space for him to be honest while pointing toward healing. The future still felt uncertain. He and Alara were taking things slowly, both aware of wounds, both committed to not repeating mistakes. But uncertainty no longer felt like threat. It felt like possibility. Silas walked to his window and looked out at Elm Street. Lights glowed in neighboring windows. A couple walked past, hand in hand. The world was full of people living, loving, trying, failing, trying again. He was part of that world again, connected, vulnerable, alive. The doorbell that had rung on that autumn evening hadn't announced an ending or simple visit. It had announced a beginning, the first note in a song he'd thought he'd forgotten how to sing. Standing there, heart open and hopeful, Silas understood the greatest gift his aunts had given him wasn't advice or comfort. They'd given him permission to hope again, to believe his story wasn't over, to trust that love, in whatever forms it took, was always worth the risk. He smiled in the darkness, feeling grateful, feeling whole, feeling ready for whatever came next.